rights, because they're reducing. We have other securities that form as assets of our. But now, to go to your question, what this kind of money could be used for, this is my opinion. We're in the face of a pandemic, and since government might not get the requisite revenues.
Sorry to cut you short. Just to correct my tongue, it will be receiving 1.2 billion. I was saying earlier 1.4. It's 1.2 billion. That's
actually,
around 3.8 trillion. But it's still pending.
It's still pending because it's allocated. One thing I didn't even mention: this kind of money is allocated according to the shareholding
of the member states,
of the certain member countries. Yeah, of the member countries in the IMF.
Okay.
Uganda's shareholding is very small. I think it's even less than 1%. But then you find countries like the United States which have about 17%. That's a voting rights. Then they have a very big. They call it quota, but I call it similar to shareholding. For instance, if you have shares in a company and they're distributing dividends, they'll be allocated according to.
So the more shares you have in IMF, the more allocation you get.
The more allocation of this printed money.
And the more priorities you get when it comes to handling crises, I get.
Exactly. But you see, the problem with this kind of money is that it's unfair in that the countries that need it the most are going to get the least of it.
I do understand
because,
that.
For instance, the United States doesn't need this kind of money. Already the United States has been doing what you would call quantitative easing. Quantitative easing, I don't want to go into the technicalities, but it's akin to something like printing money almost. What the economists want to call it is long-term interest rate management. But if you look at its function, it's introducing new money in the economy. And these monetary functions that the developed economies can use to actually offset. Even the UK, the European Central Bank, Japan, they've been using the monetary side to finance their budgets. Africa, not so much. Now, why this money is going to go, about 3% of it is going to come to the least developed countries. Then about the majority of it, the US alone is going to get about 120, 130 billion. South Africa, on the other hand, is just going to get about, Nigeria, which is the biggest economy, I thought
in Africa,
is going to get about 33 billion of it. So you see, now, because African countries have a small shareholding, and this shareholding is determined according to they determine the shareholding according to your size of your economy. So that's how it's allocated. Now we're going to have a little of it, but now my argument is, what could it be used for? When I look at the foreign reserves of Uganda, they're not really depleted. I don't think the coronavirus has depleted them unless we are shocked with new statistics. Because the last statistics I looked at for the reserves were at the height of the pandemic, and the loan they gave us, the previous loan the IMF gave us of around $300 million or $400 million, remember that last year in 2020, 70% of it was to go to Bank of Uganda to do such what they call monetary stabilization, which includes some of it going to the reserves. Yet we already had adequate reserves which were covering 3 months of import cover.
Okay.
So right as I speak right now, this is going to supplement what we already have. So I don't think, from the look of things.
So are you arguing that money is not being used? We're just piling money to our reserves, and then we don't see it going outside into the public, or what is the argument here?
The argument is, I wouldn't blame them for stockpiling reserves in the face of the pandemic, because it actually helps your credit worthiness. It gives you, if I'm coming to your economy and you don't have enough dollars to pay for whatever I'm going to buy, because I'm not going to take shillings out of this economy and spend them on the world markets. I will need the dollars. So if you have enough of them, I'll be confident I'll come into this economy and they have the dollars to settle, to pay. But what I'm saying, now that we have a pandemic, maybe part of that money could be used to since we have a shortfall in tax revenues, and we have an excess of reserves, which even have, now if you add on these special drawing rights, even going to be beyond the required law, because the law I think requires about 3 weeks, but we have 4 months of import cover. Meaning that Bank of Uganda can say, okay, the government, you have a shortfall here, let's just get a portion, not all of it, a portion of it, and it finances schools, healthcare, and even in extreme scenarios, since we're heavily indebted.
That's why I want you to correct my thinking right now. Sorry to interject. I just don't want it to fly over. I correct my thinking about having money, paid reserves in stock, and then we are having, I can say we are having a very huge public debt, and then we are having a lot of taxation. Where is the balance there? Like, how does it? We've got reserves, and then we have high taxation coming into the country. Is that fair? Like, correct my mind around that.
Well, it's not fair that if you are going to have an infusion of liquidity, because what this money does, it gives you liquidity to spend.
Okay.
Now, if the IMF has given you this kind of reserve money, of course, they will argue that we should keep it in the reserve and not use it because, again, if you overuse it, there's some kind of small interest that you have to pay as a government, 0.05%, but it's far, far less than, it's almost zero.
If we overuse,
if we
overuse the SDR.
Yes.
Okay.
It's free money because you're not going to pay it back to the IMF. If we get
yes, I mean, like how why should they concerned how I overuse?
Because
and then tax
like
me back.
For instance, this, like we said, this money is allocated according to the shareholding you have in the IMF. And once you overuse and you're below that shareholding, you have to pay an interest. But the interest is small as compared to the loans you're going to get from the market, from the treasury bonds and from even other countries. Even the IMF itself, may give you 0% loan, but the kind of interest you pay here is 0.05 for being below. But now, going back to your question, is it fair to not use that money and yet you're overtaxing the population?
The economy.
In this current, if I look at the current setup, it will be very unfair. Why? Because Bank of Uganda has demonstrated that the reserves are adequate and they have 4 months import cover. So once this money comes, it means even going to supplement even what we already have.
4 months.
So why would you overtax a population which, according to your statistics, you're demonstrating that you have some reserves which you can use to offset a few, at least in the mid-term, in the medium term, because tax they used to budget for budgeting purpose to finance the budget. It's unfair. They can actually use part of this money and not overuse it in that it is so drawn down that they even have to pay interest. The only countries I would blame are countries where, like I think even Nigeria, they have faced that problem, where you have your reserve assets might be depleted, and you feel like once the IMF gives us this money, we should just use it to buffer the reserves because they have been depleted, and then maybe we tax. But in Uganda, it is not the case. In Uganda, what we are seeing is the reserves are adequate, and the infusion of this liquidity, which is coming on 23rd, is only going to supplement. It's not going to deplete the reserves. So you can use a portion, unless, of course, there are undisclosed challenges that maybe Bank of Uganda has, the liabilities that it just uses money for. And then, speaking of the debts, like you said, we are a highly indebted country.
Yeah, we're going to be getting deeply into the debts, the debt issue, the public debt after the break, Louis. But before we head into the break, if you could, because someone might be wondering out there, like, where does IMF, get the whole capacity to print out money? Let it come from you.
Legally, thank God I'm a lawyer.
Yes,
now
you
I
being
can have
a lawyer,
comfort zone. Where do they get the capacity to print the money? Now, let me actually give you a small background, if you allow me.
Please do.
The IMF and the World Bank, well, the World Bank, I think, was formerly called the Bank for International Reconstruction. They were formed after the World War, and they are part of what you would call the Bretton Woods institutions. Now, 44 countries met at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire in the United States and agreed on a new monetary world order. At that time, Uganda was not independent, and I don't think there are very many African states that were independent. Apart from South Africa, which you could argue
British protectorate, or colonial protectorate.
Yeah, with protectorate, colonies. So at that time, you found there are 44 nations. They sat down and agreed on a world order. I don't go into why they sat, but one of the reasons why they sat was to determine how they do, not to determine a new world order, because gold was to be at the center of the financial system of the world. Fast forward, I'm not going to go into the history because of time. Where do they get authority? I'm still answering that question. Now, when you fast forward to 1962, where Uganda got independence, we subscribed to those Bretton Woods institutions by virtue of being independent nations. Now, in 1962, a law was made. It is called the Bretton Woods Agreements Act. It's a law that I don't even think there is a lawyer in practice who even knows that law exists.
Okay.
It's the Bretton Woods Agreements Act 1963. That's when it was made. So I think it was signed by Kabaka Mutesa, who was the president
in
then,
the country around here.
So we handed over certain agreements, certain instruments to the US government, which hosts the World Bank headquarters. Now, once we became a signatory to the IMF Articles of Agreement, by virtue of having Parliament passed the Bretton Woods Agreements Act 1963. That agreement binds us, and it means that any decisions the IMF makes are binding on the country. So if the IMF Executive Board and subsequently the Board of Governors sit and say we are going to print this money, it is assumed legally according to the international economic law that you are a signatory, one, to the Articles of Agreement that you entered into by virtue of making a law called the Bretton Woods Act 1963. Now, once the IMF makes any kind of institutional reforms in line with the Articles of Agreement that we signed in 1963 by virtue of enacting a law, which is called the Bretton Woods Agreements Act, they actually get the authority. And you see, this is why things get funny. The world order is very complex. It is coached, because I don't even think by the time we even signed the Articles of Agreement in 1963, anyone had an idea that the IMF is going to print money, has the capacity to print the money.
So it wasn't yet disclosed. It came after countries had been part of.
Exactly, because like like I said, in this money, it was created in 1969. Let's go for a break, Louis.
We will return surely on that one. But at least you have shined a light on to that one, where they get at least some of the responsibility to print out money in times of crisis. And we're going to also look at what other aspects does money needs to be printed. Don't go away. Smart 24 TV. We return shortly.
Smart 24, driving business.